Hey everybody, today I'm going to introduce our research assignment. We're going to be using the Library of Congress's Chronicling America historical newspaper database. One of the cool things about this research project is it's not only going to encourage you to think about historical sources and think about, the time period that we're researching in ways that's, a little more immediate. You're going to be looking at documents from that time. You're actually going to be using a database that's accessible to you, through the government freely through the Library of Congress. So it's something that if you use and you want to use, down the road, maybe long after you graduate, it's a resource that's going to be available to you. About 20 years ago, the Library of Congress really engaged in a big way in digitizing historical newspapers. Historical newspapers are a really common source used by historians, particularly before the 20th century. They are flawed sources, right? Newspapers, just as they are today, sometimes tell us a version of the truth that they want us to know, but they are useful and they do provide insight in a lot of different ways. And we're going to talk about how we're going to use this source to tell a story. So your goal in this research assignment is to pick a newspaper using the Library of Congress newspaper database. And I'm going to go over in this video how to do that. You'll pick a particular newspaper from a community that has an adequate number of issues between 1820 and 1860. Now, when I say an adequate number of issues, what I mean is that there are a lot of historical newspapers out there that only a very spotty number of issues have survived into our own time. Now, there are other newspapers in this collection that have many issues. And so what I'm going to be encouraging you to use is a newspaper from a town, where it's published, that has a critical mass of newspaper issues from the time period in question. You're going to look at newspapers only from a small period of time. So say you're interested in looking at, somewhere in Connecticut in the 1820s, you could confine yourself to maybe 1827 to 1828, maybe 1829, at the most a 3-year span. And what you're going to be doing is looking through the available issues of that newspaper from that time to look for articles, advertisements, little bits and pieces that help you tell a story of that community within that time frame. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you a little bit of idea of sort of things you might expect to find, how to find them, and what to do with them once you've found them, right? Once you've gathered your articles and you kind of know what's in there and kind of understand what you found, you're then going to write a very short, concise essay explaining what you found and how these sources help us understand that community at that particular point in American history. So, without that, let's go ahead and jump into the database. This is our website for our newspaper database, Chronicling America Historic American Newspapers. You'll find it at chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. And of course, this is part of the Library of Congress. The first thing we're going to want to do in this database is find a newspaper that we think has good material potentially for us to use as a subject for our research project, right? So we're looking for a newspaper from a town that has adequate number of issues in its collection between 1820 and 1860. And of course, it doesn't have to be that whole span of time. You might want just 2 or 3 years within that span of time. So what you're going to do to find a newspaper is go and click on all digitized newspapers, 1777 to 1963. All right. And you'll say state, all states, ethnicities, all languages. Now, if you want to show just the newspapers from a specific state, you can go ahead and, say, well, I want to look at just the newspapers from Alabama, for instance, and you hit go, right? And now it's showing you all the Alabama newspapers within this collection. Now, if you are, really want to work with an Alabama newspaper, you're going to then want to search on earliest issue, And what we see here is ultimately we have a few newspapers here that fit the bill. The Alabama State Intelligencer, there are 50 issues between 1831, the year of 1831, 50 issues. So not a huge number of newspapers, but a variety of issues available. Again, there are 70 issues of the Mobile Daily Commercial Register and Patriot in the year of 1841, between May and late November of 1841. 70 issues, which is a pretty good number. The Mobile Register and Journal, which has a little bit longer of a publishing run, 1841 to 46. There are 269 issues available, and that's pretty good. So you can see, what's available. As you go further in the list, you say, well, there's 8,088 issues of the Memphis Daily Appeal, but that goes all the way to 1886 from 1857, and of course, that is beyond the scope of our research, as are all the other papers in this list subsequently. So if we click on any one of these, like the Alabama State Intelligencer, we click on the title. When you click on this newspaper title, there's a little essay here that tells you a little bit about the paper's publisher, how often it was published, when it was published, who published it. And again, here it's talking about the goals of the newspaper, and kind of the things that they do. Talks about the political leanings often about the newspaper, and the sort of interesting stories that might appear in this newspaper. And in this case, it's talking about, there's quite a bit of news about Indian removal, which we'll be talking about in our class here in this newspaper. So again, telling you, published at Tuscaloosa, which is the present-day home of the University of Alabama. The other thing you can do is go and browse issues. All right. So here we can see that this newspaper is probably printed once a week, and the publication date switches from a Saturday to a Wednesday, and then ultimately ends up being published on Saturdays again. I guess they decided that was a better idea to do. We don't have a ton of issues for this newspaper. This drop-down box just shows us there are only issues for 1831 available. And if you want to look at an issue, you can go ahead and click on the date. And I'm just going to kind of scroll through it. One thing you'll notice is that the type on 19th century, or especially the first half of 19th century newspapers, is rather small. Now you can go and just kind of zoom in by using, in this case I'm using a trackpad, and the pinching and spreading out of the, here we have a bunch of legal notices on the front page, a song reprinted. There are a lot of different things in the newspaper. Here's international news, affairs of Belgium, affairs of Italy. And so, just kind of going around how to navigate around a newspaper. This has got 4 pages, so we can go on page 2, right? Our news stories go. Page 3, we start to get things like advertising, and you'll find a lot of newspapers will have advertising actually on the front page. This paper has more legal notices. Here's a different newspaper being advertising here, the Southern Argus, preparatory school for women being advertised. You want to send your daughter off to boarding school, and so on. All the pages back to page 4, and here we start to see things like classifieds, a common thing in newspapers really from the very beginning. Here we have bulk goods. Here's a summer retreat, traveler's rest. At the sign of the rising sun, Tuscaloosa, the proprietor of the City Hotel returns his sincere thanks to customers and talks about how you can stay at the house of the rising sun in Tuscaloosa. What could possibly go wrong? And so it's really relatively easy to go and navigate the newspaper. You can also do things, of course, like download the image. You can download a PDF uh, of the image, right, like that, right? So there's our PDF. This is on a Mac, which makes things relatively easy. You can go ahead and download that and put that into a folder. I'm not going to do that. That will download a very nice, crisp, high-resolution image of the paper. And of course, when you find a page in an article that you think is going to be useful, I very much encourage you to download the actual article. So that's how we navigate around the newspaper. Now let's talk about, the kind of things that we might expect when we're looking. Take a look at a newspaper where, we can get a little better of idea of what the sort of kind of things that we might find in an early American newspaper. This case, I've got the Litchfield Inquirer from Litchfield, Connecticut, from Thursday, January 29th, 1829. So, the sort of Age of Jackson type newspaper. So we scroll down, we can see, again, it's a little bit different than the last newspaper we looked at, slightly different time period. And, the Litchfield Inquirer serves, in some ways, a different purpose, but similar purposes. All newspapers have some things in common. One thing you'll notice is that northern newspapers do tend to have illustrations. Now, these are what they call cartouches, which are, basically like the early newspaper version of clip art. But the northern newspapers also have a bigger variety of type sizes. You'll notice that last newspaper we looked at from Alabama, being printed a decade later, still is mostly in this little typeface, partly to conserve paper, but also simply because they do not have quite the range of typing, where this is a New England newspaper where there is a much deeper tradition of publications. So just kind of overlooking the page here, trying to decide what's useful and what isn't useful in terms of your research. Now, you might be gravitating to these articles and say, kind of ignoring these ads, and you read that, oh, this is somebody talking about artificial eyes, and this doesn't really seem to have anything to do with the local area, and you would be correct. And it's just somebody going on a personal interest story. Another article about self-love. Here's one that's been reprinted from the Nantucket Enquirer. One of the things you need to look at is that newspapers of this time would very much often reprint stories from other newspapers within the region. This is before, in the case of 1829, before there was syndication, what we think of as like the Associated Press or Reuters or, all these other different news agencies. They emerge after the invention of the telegraph in 1844. And some of your later newspapers will have what they call the dateline, where it'll say, the article will start out saying, Richmond, and then it'll be to say that this is an article from Richmond, Virginia, not a local article about something going on. Usually, though, these newspapers, before syndication, again, this is an article taken out of the Nantucket Enquirer, probably without any permission. And it is an interesting article. It's talking about a woman who was rescued by a young man. What she was doing was on the beach, and she saw some merchandise. So in the 1820s, if a ship wrecked along the coast and the merchandise washed ashore, it was the right of the people who lived along the shore to be able to have right of salvage. So anything that ended up on shore was theirs if they could take it away. And she discovers a bolt of cloth, and even though it is 14 degrees out, goes to get it, and it almost drowns her. This young man rescues her, and then he says, well, gosh, I should be entitled to part of the cloth. And then she says, no, you are not entitled to any of the cloth. and her clothes were freezing to her, and they actually got her to safety and saved her life, but she wasn't giving up the cloth. That's part of a culture of this time period. You would have to know that to understand what's going on the article. And so, some of these things are going to be unfamiliar to you. If you come across a story and you really can't quite make out what's going on, that's a good time to email me and say, hey, I've got this story. Maybe email me the PDF and say, I'm not just really sure what's going on here. But you might be, again, drawn to these articles, and here is again, a little sort of political wisdom story. And so you'll see a lot of things like this in the newspaper. Again, breach of marriage promise. And so this is, again, something from the Cincinnati Chronicle. This is kind of like if you go to something like the Baton Rouge Advocate today, and there are all these like kind of clickbait articles down at the bottom that aren't really news, but they're kind of human interest. One thing you realize is actually that kind of thing isn't anything new. But I want to draw your attention over here to sort of useful news, advertisements that are here. And, there are actually some really interesting things going on in the advertisements on this paper. You say, well, I'm looking for articles, but advertisements are important too, and they help us with what we call material culture, or, kind of thinking about the things and commerce of a community. I don't know if you remember when in the lecture I was talking about how, we use probate courts. Again, there are notices of probate where people's wills are being read. And so if, for instance, that person owed you any money, you could go make a claim against the estate, and there was a window of time for you to do that. And so in this case, this person is represented as being insolvent, so if you needed any money out of them, good luck. But I'm drawn to this chairs ad. Chairs just received at the cabinet and chair warehouse of the subscriber, i.e. the person who took out the ad, East Street, Litchfield, a large assortment of fashionable chairs on consignment from L. Hitchcock's manufactory, which are offered for sale cheap for cash. Interesting. So we know that John Dewey is the subscriber here. And if you had the ability to go in and do Ancestry.com, you would find out actually his ancestors came in on the Mayflower. I did that at some point, not to salt the well here. But let's talk about the L. Hitchcock's chairs. So whenever you have a specific name, it's worth looking up. In this case, Hitchcock's chairs. It was a factory. Can I Google something like that and find out more? Maybe there's, maybe the factory still exists, or maybe it existed for a long time and we could learn more about this manufacturing establishment. In this case, the answer is yes. The Hitchcock chair is actually a thing, as people like to say. There are even reproduction Hitchcock chairs, and we see now that Hitchcock chairs are very collectible. There are knockoffs. There's the Hitchcock Chair Company, which has its website, which has gone dark because it went out of business. So anyway, apparently they're starting the company again. Antique Spotlight, Hitchcock chairs, dusty old thing. So at any rate, there's quite a bit actually written about Hitchcock chairs. And in fact, started by Lambert, the L. Hitchcock of Hitchcock's chairs. It's a local operation, Barkhamsted, Connecticut. And so, you start thinking about that. This is a period of time when the Connecticut River Valley started manufacturing all kinds of things. This is actually a really great local story, because here we have an ad for this really significant local thing, being manufactured at a time, the Connecticut River Valley is very symbolic of the time, and it's just an ad. right? This ad tells us a lot about the region. You could use this research that you find Googling some of these items, in this case, probably relatively reliable information about these chairs. Antique collectors are obsessive about stuff like that. And you can tell the story about the chairs and how they're for sale here, and they're in this little town in Connecticut. Another ad that's kind of cool is this Pioneer line that even has its own image with the Stagecoach. This is 1829. People are moving around, not by train, because trains more or less haven't yet been invented yet. I mean, the steam engine has been invented, but the trains have yet to take to the rails. And so people are getting, on a stagecoach. And this is actually a pretty detailed ad. And you can ponder, use your imagination. Think about what it would be like to leave Litchfield at 8 o'clock in the morning on a stagecoach and arrive in Hartford at 4 o'clock in the evening. So that's what, a full 8-hour day in a stagecoach, which, let me tell you what, would be a bone-rattling experience. And it tells you not only how long it's going to take, and which days it goes, but the route via Northfield, Plymouth, Bristol, and Farmington to Hartford, and then returns from Hartford on the same route the next days, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and then from Litchfield via Harwinton, Burlington, Farmington to Hartford, right? So it's giving these two different routes. Well, consider the distance between Litchfield and New Haven. All of a sudden you begin to see that this is a fairly long distance. There's Hartford, so you get to Litchfield from New Haven. You're not going to take Interstate 91, but you would probably take in some of these older roads. We see some of the towns mentioned. There's Bristol, for instance. And so you can think about this travel that people would have been engaging in this Connecticut River Valley, and how these towns were connected, and how in this period of time before the train, you would take the stagecoach, right? For New Haven and New York, you have another further, journey, if you can imagine going all the way to New York from Litchfield by stagecoach. So these are sort of some of the things that you can find in a newspaper like this. There are kind of funny things here. Taken up by the subscriber in a suffering condition, 2 swine, one spotted and one white, with rings in their noses. The owner is requested to prove property, pay charges, and take them. That gives you an idea of this being kind of a rural area. Here we have a farm for sale, 54 acres. So we get the idea of a size of a farm. What a nice farm in this area would look like. Said land is divided to mowing and pasture. Cuts hay sufficient to winter 15 cows. And so the importance of cattle. And again, here's another farm for sale. Forum in Litchfield County, right? 100 acres. Pasture for 12 cows, and yields 20 tons of first quality upland hay, which goes to tell you, that in fact these cows, this is probably a dairy raising area. They're not growing, tobacco or cotton or things like that. But here's a really interesting detail. The local advantage of the situation in point of society and school privileges are surpassed by none in the country. Talking about Litchfield having public schools, which is very rare. The New England public schools being very early to the system of public education in America. So just on the front page of this newspaper, within its advertisements, we find quite a lot of interesting things. Look at another newspaper here. This is a different sheet. It's from the Mobile Register, nearby Mobile, Alabama, March 13th, 1845. As we can see, that from a little later period of time, the newspapers are a little more involved. This is a pretty good sized newspaper. The Mobile Register is an interesting newspaper to use because, of course, Mobile is a port city. So there's all kinds of activity, and it's a one of the larger cities in the region in the South. And so we kind of peruse like a lot of newspapers. There's lots of advertising on the front, and so as a port city, you're going to have lots of different things showing up at the port. Here, cottonseed 40 sacks. So soap and starch, molasses, butter, champagne, 50 baskets, key brand of this year's importation, right? And these different wholesale merchants. These aren't things for people to buy, but these are for commercial agents. So, 15 kegs of Goshen butter in store and for sale. Liverpool coal. So, coal that's recently come in from England. White lead, superfine #1. That's not from around Alabama. Scotch pig iron. So iron that's come in from Scotland. Scotch ale. Molasses. Lancashire potatoes. So potatoes, British style. Whiskey. All kinds of things. Loaf sugar. Coffee, 50 bags of Java, very superior article. So Tuscaloosa coal, coal that would have come down the river from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So you get an idea of the sort of kind of merchandise that would show up, Havana cigars, all these kinds of things. But there's a particularly interesting ad here, I find, and it has to do with the opening of a restaurant, and it's the Arcade Restaurant, or as they would have been called in the 1840s. The N is something, so in the French, restaurant, so that a lot of times early on they weren't spelling it. So restaurants in the 1840s are relatively new. The idea of a restaurant, people ate at boarding houses. But a restaurant that would be open at all hours, right? And so he talks about, where the restaurant is, so you can get kind of an idea of where it is in downtown Mobile, if you wanted to Google that and look it up. And it tells the hours and everything, of course. Breakfast 7 to 10, dinner from 1 to 4, dinner, of course, being our lunch, and supper from 6 to 9 o'clock. And they are open. Of course, they also offer board, and they have wines, dessert, fruit, etc. So that's kind of a cool thing. You can go and go to the next page, navigate there. And here we have all kinds of news stories, but of course, in this issue, we're going up here, and Thursday morning. So these are date lines from the Washington Globe. So these are news stories from elsewhere, right? And so these are national political things, so that not necessarily local in nature. But over here, we see, again, much like we did in New England, how people are getting around. So regular steamboat service to New Orleans, right? For Macon, this is on the Noxubee River, Macon. Alabama, probably not Alabama, Georgia, Columbus. They're talking about Columbus, Mississippi, going up the river, telling on the steamer Dallas, right? This is after, the steamboat revolution. Steamboats are really starting to come into their own. The Cahaba River, the steamboat Little Harriet, and so on. All these different places that you could go along the river on, from Mobile, and how, the river and the relationship between Mobile and steam, and the growth of a port city in steam was, of course, African Americans, enslaved African Americans are a staple of the newspaper, and this in of itself, we think here, all very likely, meaning, in good condition, for sale on credit of 12 months. So you can buy 8 human beings on credit for a month. Lost a hair bracelet. If you don't know what a hair bracelet is actually mourning jewelry, if you will. By mourning, I mean, so usually the deceased person would have they'd collect some of the hair of the deceased person and fashion it into a piece of jewelry. That's what hair jewelry would have been, and why it had such a high sentimental value to the person who lost it. Here is a rather splashy article, Stop the Murder, and you'll find that if you search on this in the search terms, this little article / ad, in a lot of ways, this is part ad, this is part news article, but here we have an incident where supposedly a free African-American mixed-race man by the name of Thomas Henry has murdered 2 men named Joshua and James Hawthorne, presumably brothers, in Belleville, Conecuh County, Alabama. And so this would have been, of course, a big news story. And again, talking about, people moving around. And the fellow formerly lived in Florida and is acquainted about Pensacola, to which place, or to Mobile, he will probably make his way. So it's being advertised in Mobile. And again, here is another one, the runaway slave ad with the little cartouche, the guy with it. But it's quite a detailed description of the person being sought by the advertiser. He talks about how he chews a great deal of tobacco and smoking. He's say what he's wearing, but also that he likes to fiddle and play the fiddle and so forth. And a little bit of family history. I bought Harry, the enslaved person's name, with his wife about 15 months ago, and from whom it tells really a little bit of a life story of this runaway seeking his own freedom in the ad. And we continue on to the next page. We see more advertisements. Again, being a port city, right? We can see ocean going. So very much showing you how connected Mobile is to the rest of the world. Here's a ship leaving for Liverpool. There's quite a lot of commerce between Liverpool and Mobile at this time. What are they carrying? Overwhelmingly cotton, right? This is one of the big exports. But you can see how many ships are going for Greenstock, for Glasgow, into Scotland, taking cotton to the mills in Scotland, to Matagorda, Texas, near the Spanish border, for New York, right? The sort of commerce that is going between New York and Mobile. You can tell an awful lot from this list of commerce being shipped. Let's see if I can scroll down. There was another very interesting ad here. So there's properties for sale. Country residence for sale. Talking about where it is. Napoleon, the shrubbery, various kinds, their premises. And then the terms. But this tells you a little bit sort of the casual nature of slavery, of being something in, in the culture, will be sold for low cash or exchanged for Negroes. In other words, this person's willing to sell this country home and 2.5 acres and, everything on it for money or for enslaved people. Again, this newspaper offers you an awful lot of opportunity to think, just through the advertisements alone, what the community was like.